Wonderful. Well, good afternoon and welcome. And Francoise, thank you very much both for inviting me personally, but also more importantly for organising this wonderful workshop. I turned 80 in September, on September the 20th. So I thought that I would use this occasion to do a little bit of autobiographical reflection to set the ball rolling, and using that to make a couple of comments about why I think that the category row is rather problematic in certain ways. And I want to do it through a focus on gender. Let me begin, though, just to say that I also feel a slight pretender because I have only just, in fact, it hasn't yet come out, but Francoise and I are just about to succeed in publishing a paper on Shaman's Garden. So that will be my first ever ethnobotanical publication. So that's, at last I have the proper credentials, but only just. Now, why plants? Well, despite the fact that I haven't published about plants, I've spent my life being interested in plants. I was brought up in Jamaica, and at school I read Wallace, Spruce, and Bates, the three great 19th century British explorer scientists of the Amazon. So, and through them I discovered Northwest Amazonia, the Vaupes River of Northwest Amazonia. And I knew from childhood or young teenagerhood that I was going to go to Amazonia and going to study with Indians. And the other great thing that happened to me at school was I met my wife, Christine, at the tender age of 14. We're still married, and I went and did field research with her. And she is a very strong absent presence here because it's she who's actually published a whole monograph, basically, about manioc, which is about plants. Our field research project was about Levi-Strauss's myth, and we went to check it out on the field, and we knew already that we needed to know about plants, animals, and even stars. So we went equipped with field guides and star charts, and we even actually, I think I must be one of the few anthropologists who went to the field with a plant press. So botany was very much in my mind. And and one of the things that we very soon realized was it wasn't necessarily the showy plants which were interesting. This thing called Sabicea amazonensis, or buyuyu in the lingua franca, or cana in Barasana, is a common garden or plantation weed, which is probably the most important symbolic plant in Northwest Amazonia. The repetition of the syllables bu suggests it's a plant of repetition. It has little pink fruits along a line, and that is read as a line of people, and these are the beating hearts along a line of people. And every time you go through any ritual, you have to eat these sweet little fruits, and that leads me, I could go into a whole discussion about plant metaphors for what we call lineages, etc., but I haven't got time. Anyhow, that was one of this kind of reason why a little amount of botanical training, because both Christian and I studied zoology and botany at school, that was very useful to me. And another reason was that the Tukanoan with whom we worked have the peculiar totemic system in which there are a series of language groups, and each language group doesn't just own a language, but it owns varieties of plants. So that you actually have to be quite clever to know which varieties of coca or which varieties of manioc belong to which group. So that was another reason why being attentive to plants was extremely important. Predictably enough, doing field research involved a division of labor. So because I was with the men and Christine was with the women, the men's world was dominated by what we now learn as rao plants, tobacco, coca, and ayahuasca. And right, okay. This is ayahuasca, and one of the things that's
your show. Yes, your show. Look at it.
apparently it's all right.
Yeah.
The vines at the back are ayahuasca vines, and the Tucanoans smash up the bark off those vines and mix it with cold water and drink it. And the leaves are an addition which partly they control the effect, so you can control the color of your visions. And interestingly, they punch a little hole in the leaf and they hold it against the light. And just by looking at the currents, you can see sort of refraction currents on this film of leaf. They can tell the strength of what you're drinking. So anyhow, I spent my life chewing coca, smoking and snuffing tobacco, and occasionally drinking ayahuasca. And I worked with the famous ethnobotanist Richard Evans Schultes on precisely this Banisteriopsis rusbiana ayahuasca edition, and he published a little paper on it. So as I say, I have some credentials. So if my world was, how do I, yes. If my world was dominated by rao plants, Christine's world was dominated, that is Christine working in the manioc gardens with her great friend Paulina. Her world was dominated by manioc and agriculture, and it was extremely difficult for her because it was bloody hard work. And she would come home every evening and say, "What did you discover today?" And I said, "Oh, well, Pasico told me the story of the origin of coca." And she said, "Well, that's all bloody well for you. It was okay for you. I spent a whole bloody day in the manioc gardens covered in sweat bees, and I haven't learned a thing." But in the end, her misery became a triumph because she wrote a monograph which is basically phrased around manioc. And what she discovered was that what everybody had thought was self-evident, well, they just cook manioc. So what? First thing she discovered was actually the famous TPT, which is supposedly the thing which extracts the poison from manioc, doesn't do anything of the sort. All it does is it dries the pulp, which has already been washed to get rid of the poison. And she also showed that that women cultivating manioc are looking after their babies, and when they grate the manioc up, they separate it out into basically flesh and bones. They then put them together in measured quantities and they cook a baby on the hot plate. And that's one interesting difference between men and women in relation to plants, that women in this society, women are called the mothers of manioc. This book I'm going to come back to over decolonization is called The Mothers of Food, and it's a book all about manioc. So that whereas the women make, care for, tend, and look after manioc tubers and make infants as they cook, the male relation to rao plants is one of violence. Rao plants, coca is the dead body of a man, and you pick the leaves off his body, smash them up, toast them, and then eat them. Manioc, ayahuasca are the vines, are the fingers and toes of a baby, which was stolen from the women and killed. And so that every time you consume ayahuasca, you're pulling off the fingers of a baby and smashing it up. And so that and all male crops are that all male plant foods are either fruits or leaves or bark, which they all involve picking and destruction, whilst there's a very strong genderized division there. So, well, the other thing is the other reason why plants entered into my world was that, so I'm just checking that I'm not exceeding time. The annual round, the male annual round, or the male ritual, the ritual round is focused on mostly on ground plants, so that during every ritual, the rituals in one sense are a ritualization of coca, tobacco, and manioc, and ayahuasca, so that the rituals consist of they consist of sessions of dancing where people are high on ayahuasca, and this is the only occasion in which people take ayahuasca is when they're dancing in rituals. And one of the effects of ayahuasca is to coordinate a line of dancers. And I can speak from experience here. If you dance in a line of dancers under ayahuasca, you feel like leg 34 of a centipede. You simply cannot go wrong. It's like a collective body. And what they dance, and then they all sit down, and all the male dancers sit in a row, and the first thing that happens is a senior comes round and he offers you a large bowl of coca powder and a cigar, having blown tobacco snuff up your nose. And each person is greeted in turn with coca powder and tobacco. The cigar is passed backwards and forwards along the lines. And then they chant. They start chanting, and they chant for about an hour or more. And the chants consist of, they're largely focused on coca, tobacco, and ayahuasca. And they are about how people obtain these plants and how the different varieties became distributed across different groups. So that in one sense, the whole ritual is focused on these plants. The other set of plants which form a focus are tree fruits, because there is an extremely important set of ideas that young men in particular, but children also, are the fruits of trees. And so in order to guarantee that the trees remain fertile and produce fruit each year, they say that you have to do this ritual. So they describe the rituals as manejo del mundo in Spanish, the management of the world in order to ensure that the seasons repeat. And this is all tied up with astronomical observations, so that our star charts, which we hoped would be useful, turned out to be absolutely critical. So that there is a coordination here between notions of time and notions of plants. So I'm just looking at how am I doing? Not bad. I've lost my.
On plant foods.
So I guess I was going to end up by talking briefly about what has changed, because I thought I should enter into the discussion of decolonization. One of the things that happened in Colombia in 1991 was that the Colombian government produced a new constitution, and one of the changes was that the Catholic missions and Protestant missionaries were expelled, and the Catholic and Protestant missionaries had been responsible for all education. So Christine and I were invited back to try to plan a new system of education. The Indians were given the right to manage their own education. They had to conform to the basic curriculum in terms of substance, but how they did it, they had to, for instance, teach history, but they started from their own history, and they had to teach languages, but whereas in Bogota you would start, you learned your first language from your mother, Spanish, and then you would start with normally with English. For indigenous people, their mother's language, actually, in this case, their father's language, people speak their father's language, was their own language, and their second language was Spanish. And in terms of education, they could have a culturally appropriate education. So they asked me to go back and help them organize the system of education. And one of the things I realized, I'd never done anything like this. So I thought, well, I'm going to start by asking questions about what people knew and knew they knew, and what they knew when we had these big meetings. They had discussions about culture, and I immediately identified ritual and rao plants as what they knew about, and they said that is culture. But halfway through the meeting, they said, hang on a minute, what about the women? Of course, there were no women in these meetings, it was all men. So they said, women, come and tell us, what is your culture? And a couple of women came in and they said, culture. Oh, I know what it must be, if it's what stuff we know. What we know about is cultivation, manure. So they decided, well, this is obviously our culture. So that was okay. Anyhow, I started by this educational program by saying, look, we can divide knowledge into three kinds. Things you know and know you know, which is basically men's ritual. Things you know about, but don't know you know about them. And then there are things that you must know. And the things you must know and don't know is obviously Western mathematics, Western chemistry, biology, etc. But I said, look, you actually know a great deal, although you've never heard of it in these terms, you know one hell of a lot of botany and one hell of a lot of zoology, etc. So we went out into the fields, and on one occasion I said, listen, we're going to sit quiet for 20 minutes and you're just going to record every sound that you've heard, and then we will go back and talk about what you knew. And they produced lists of umpteen species of birds and insects and things, and they could tell the time of day, the season, and all sorts of other things, the weather, just from sound. So I said, well, look, there are no Western scientists who could have done that. You know this stuff, but you didn't know that it was called botany or zoology or climatology. These ologies you're going to have to learn, but you know quite a lot about it already. So that was another way of focusing their attention on their own knowledge. And that led to a system of education where the teachers had to first do research in their own culture in order to transmit their knowledge. And one of the results of this has been the publication of two books. This one is called The Territory of the Jaguar, the Ancestral Trumpet Jaguars. And this is actually all about male knowledge. This is men's culture. And you can see immediately this. Well, I'll leave it for you to look at, but these are illustrations of men preparing cocoa powder, for instance. So this book is full of rao plants, in a sense. Quite a large amount of the total contents of the book is rao plants. It's a very heavy, big, and rather showy book, and it was part of the fact that their knowledge became recognized by UNESCO as World Immaterial Heritage. This rather modest-looking book has just come out this year, and this is the women's book, because the women are, many years after this book came out, the women said, we want our own book. And we know we've got a lot of knowledge, but nobody's given it any recognition. And so they produced this book, and this book is deceptively small because it's actually extremely weighty. It's made so that you can put it in your pocket, and it's got special manure garden-proof paper and a nice solid cover. And if you have the right technology, if you download the app on your iPhone or cell phone, which they all now have, you can actually make this book talk, because not only can you read it, but it will tell you the mythology of manioc and other plants, and it'll also tell you the chants. So here is an example of two genderized works, rather deceptive looking works, but about these two categories of plants. Now, what I was going to end up by saying is that I think that, so that what the major change in terms of our research was that we moved our relation with the Tucanoans and everybody else's is to move from a relation of working on to working with, because once I started in this educational program, instead of extracting information from people like blood out of a stone, they said, Stephen, you damn well got to know what you're talking about if you're going to work on our own education. So they became cooperative with me. And this leads me to a final comment, and then I will stop, which is that I have worries about the category row, because it seems to me that the category row, it falls into precisely this same gendered notion that the row plants are the men's drug plants, the psychoactive plants, which are the plants have, ayahuasca has a mother, etc. They fit the category perfectly, whilst manioc would be excluded from this category. However, manioc is also a poison. Today, unfortunately, it's the preferred way of killing yourself if you're a young lady, and there's an awful lot of young female suicides using manioc juice. So manioc is actually highly toxic, but also it's highly nutritious. It has its own mothers, not only the mothers who cultivate it, but also there are a whole lot of ancestral spirit mothers, but it wouldn't be classified as a row plant. So I just want to stop there by saying that for me, the problem with row plants as a category is it's a bit like importing the category taboo or mana or shaman, or all these words which have come from other ethnographic contexts, which we use rather loosely in our own ethnography, and yet they delude us, or they betray us, because they lead us down dangerous paths. And I could talk a lot about the problems with the category shaman, but I won't. But anyhow, I think that it's an interesting category, and certainly the Tucanoans would recognize it very strongly and think row plants are wonderful and the most important plants of all. But I'm not sure that I would always agree with them. Thank you.
Well, really wanted to thank Barbara and Stefan for inviting me to this workshop. I'm really thrilled to be here. Sorry I'm not there in person, but I'm going to share my screen. Humans are bodies in motion. We move with our hands and legs, on prosthetics and wheelchairs, on horses, donkeys, and camels, on ships, planes, trains, and automobiles. Muscles propel motion. Hearts beat, blood circulate, food digests, lungs respire. Our bodies move atop oceans, forever in motion. Using the power of indeterminate growth, plants also constantly move as their limbs seek sun-soaked canopies and their roots move deep and wide in search of water and nutrients. Plant pollen and seeds disperse afar through human, more than human, and elemental life. Fungal hyphae span the earth. Life on Darwin's majestic and tangled banks, clothed with plants, singing birds, flitting insects, and crawling worms on damp earth, continue to celebrate a vibrant and brangled life, forever inventive, ingenious, and playful. Years ago, plants would have seemed an odd focus to revisit histories of colonialism for me, but research for my recent book astonished me. Understanding plant worlds through history reveals how central plants were to colonialism and vice versa. The history of colonial botany is a story about more than plant worlds, how some plants, animals, and colonized humans were used by and for the colonial project. By centering the plant, we see how colonists remade plants in their image for their needs, consumption, profit, and for empire. By separating the world into nature and culture, biology elides the role of the humans on the environment. We need to bring back the human, back into the natural, a nature cultural world. I use the word embrangled instead of entangled or intertwined to capture the state of being embroiled or mired in something deep, interconnected, visceral. Interdisciplinarity can help us understand the fraught histories of nature cultural embranglements, and in so doing, introduce generative alternatives to study global flora. But first, let us ask, what did colonizers do to the land and its inhabitants? And here I find Leanne Simpson extremely useful when she argues and summarizes really what the colonizers have always been trying to figure out. How do you extract natural resources from the land when the peoples whose territory you're on believe that those plant, animal, and minerals have both spirit and therefore agency? And this is something that I think Steven recently just talked about. And she answers in three parts. You use gender violence to remove indigenous people and their descendants from the land. You remove agency from plant and animal worlds. And finally, you reposition land as natural resources for the use and betterment of white people. Colonialism is fundamentally a story of violence. A teeming, inventive life on Earth decimated, cleaved into hierarchies of human and non-human, superior and inferior, master and slave, native and alien. A vibrant, vital planet rendered into desolate landscapes of cracked and crushed Earth. An ecological apocalypse of pillaged lands and peoples through slavery and empire. So much of history remains grounded in the internal histories of the West and the biosciences. The power and enduring legacy of colonialism is best captured by the term coloniality. And as Edward Glisson argues, West is not a place, it is a project. Colonialism wasn't a historical blip or moment in history, but an enduring installation, an infrastructure of coloniality, epistemologies, methodologies, and methods. Coloniality's infrastructure, grounded on race and gender, erased and marginalized other modes of social organization and myriad local systems of knowing the world over. One of the key insights of feminist work in the sciences is that even though nature is consistently gendered feminine, for example, Mother Earth, biology has persistently shaped the workings of nature as masculine and patriarchal. The rise of botany transposed colonial views of binary sex and gender, compulsory heterosexuality, and Eurocentrism onto nature. No surprise then that we have more scientific work on competition than on cooperation, more on conflict than on coexistence, more on battle between the sexes than on joyful cooperative living. Science, in short, has transformed the deep, majestic history of plant time into the reductionist linear time of botany. Colonial thought has remade plant worlds in their image. How might we undo these histories to examine, critique, and reimagine? And here I do it by queering botany, challenging our normative theories of heterosexuality, reproduction, and native geography that ground our politics of identity and place. Queer studies emphasizes the need of thinking about sexuality not in terms of bodies or identity, but as fields of power. To think, read, or act queerly is to think across boundaries, beyond the normal and the normative, to explore the spaces deemed marginal, vulnerable, precarious, and perverse. To celebrate, in Angela Willie's words, queer feminist desires for new modes of conceptualization and new forms of belonging. In queering our politics of place, we see how biology is rooted not in land, but in colonial scripts. In 3 acts, I trace botanical history to challenge binary claims of native and foreign, male and female. I offer it as a serious reflection on the term invasive species and plant reproduction. I conclude with developing the idea of migrant ecologies. Act 1, Migrant Geographies. Plants were reimagined through colonialism as botany, where the deep time of plants are compressed into regimes of human time and capital. They were reimagined as gentlemen and ladies on nuptial beds as husbands and wives, their reproductive parts imagined as human genitalia. Inhabited lands were deemed terra nullius, where colonialists discovered plants long known to locals. Consider the biography of the quintessential invasive species in the United States, kudzu. It was first exhibited as an ornamental in the World's Fairs in Philadelphia in the late 19th century and was then adopted by U.S. Department of Agriculture and given to willing farmers who were paid to plant kudzu on their impoverished land to nourish soil and to prevent soil erosion. When they grew luxuriously, they were rendered dangerously invasive. So with the Amur honeysuckle, Japanese knotweed, the Japanese barberry, and the list goes on. Garlic mustard, Phragmites, tamarisk, Japanese honeysuckle, Chinese privet, and the curiously named tree of heaven. A vast majority were brought not by lay people, but trained scientists, plant explorers, horticulturalists, agriculturalists, plant breeders, ecologists, and forest managers. Thinking contemporary invasion biology alongside colonial botany reveals a profound botanical amnesia. Consider migration to the US in the last 100 years. During colonial rule, there was a laissez-faire attitude and unlimited mobility across borders. As Alfred Crosby argues, colonists built new Europes wherever they went. Settler colonists ravaged native populations of humans, plants, and animals. Where Europeans went, their agriculture and animals went. They thrived while indigenous ecosystems collapsed. Capitalist logics fueled a global flora, mass export of resources out of the colonies, and growing ravages of the environment through unchecked industrialization and development in newly independent post-colonial nations. For example, in the late 19th and early 20th century, the USDA had an active program where they sent biologists as explorers to roam the globe to find new plants. Dr. David Fairchild, one individual, brought more than 200,000 species and varieties into the United States. Such an open policy was indeed the norm until late in the 19th century. White colonists remade themselves as the American natives and enacted strict racial border policies to exclude the foreign. Quarantine laws developed alongside human exclusion acts such as the Chinese Exclusion Act and then the larger Immigration Act of 1924. A botanical reckoning means undoing botany's theories of global flora to unravel the coloniality of biogeography, a profound recognition that frameworks of nature in place and out of place are political constructions, fossilizing particular evolutionary ecological moments as true native nature for posterity. Biological nostalgia is fundamentally an unecological project. A vast literature reminds us that invasive species are not the problem, but rather the symptom of a much larger problem. Unchecked development, exploitative environmental policy, unbridled capitalist greed, rapacious growth to feed the gods of modernity. In fact, the distribution of naturalized species across the world today are a direct product of the histories of European colonialism, a legacy that has indelibly shaped and structured all contemporary ecosystems. What then does it mean to save native species and native geographies when there are no longer native environments? The complex history of motility, mobility, and migrations of multi-species biologies is a story of our planet, its past, present, and future. How can we jettison the unhelpful and unproductive language of native and foreign? I suggest we move to migrant ecologies. Act 2, Migrant Biographies. Plants have evolved immeasurable ways to travel. Their limbs stretch out, their roots explore, their pollen and seeds disperse far and wide. They reach each other through insects, birds, bats, and mammals. They engage the elements, air, water, fire, and earth in their travels. Their migratory paths exploded through colonial travel. Sex, gender, race, and sexuality thus loom large in our stories of migration. Reductive logics of heteronormative reproduction grounds all stories of biological evolution, plants, animals, and human. We must recognize the limited languages of not only sexuality, but also community, intimacy, and belonging. The point is not whether plants have sex or not. The point is our obsession with sex and our inability to think and talk about the biological without the language of sex. We reduce the thoroughly inventive and playful intimacies of plants into tired old Victorian scripts of gentlemen and ladies. As Londa Schiebinger reveals, these are categories Carl Linnaeus used for a scientific classification that was both abstract and universal. Linnaeus gave primacy to plant sexuality, and the scientization of botany coincided with an ardent sexualization of plants. Schiebinger argues that the scientific revolution and the revolution in sexuality and gender came together to elevate plant sexuality as a central focus of botany. In his nomenclature, he did not use stamens and pistils, but instead used the word andria and gynea, derived from Greek for husband and wife. Linnaeus saw plants as having sex in the fullest sense of the term, Schiebinger argues. He borrowed terms for romance, eroticism, and the sanctity of love, nuptials, and marriage into his repertoire of vocabulary for plants. His renowned Key to the Sexual System was founded on Nuptiae Plantarum, or the marriage of plants. Eurocentric sexual mores, binary sex and sexuality ground plant biology even today. A quick look at plant biology easily allows us to see the impoverished frameworks of the European housewife. So, for example, plants are divided into male and female, whether it's male plant, or male pots, male flowers and female plants, as in bisexual angiosperms. And if you look at the bottom, a language we still currently use, there is a corresponding plant reproductive part for every part of human genitals. And so it's a one-to-one correspondence in how we have imagined plants. But of course, plants do something very different, or rather many things very different. And so we have had to come up with a large number of terminology in botany to accommodate the exuberant plant reproductive possibilities. So we have to invent androecious when there are only male flowers, or gynoecious when there are only female flowers, or androdioecious where they have male flowers on some plants and bisexual ones on the other, or gynodioecious, or androgynomonoecious, or andromonoecious, or polymonodioecious, or polygamomonoecious, or subdioecious, or subgynoecious, or trimonoecious, or trioecious. I think you get the picture. The proliferation of terms is to accommodate a word of seemingly infinite and imaginative plant variation into the limited vocabulary of European sex lives. Why look through eyes of European puritanical sexuality on the plants? We must also ask, do plants even have sex? Males and females never touch, meet, feel, engage. If sex is about union, closeness, attraction, intimacy, contact, engagement, feeling pleasure, who exactly is having sex here? Flowers are intimate with insects, birds, bats, intimate with the wind as the pollen glides in its flows, intimate with water as pollen floats in its streams, fostered through millions of years of coevolution. An ableist vocabulary in botany laments the sessile, grounded, immobile plant. Yet this cursory overview of plants shows a wildly agentic plant world. We must undo the colonial language of botany. Madeline Bartlett and I suggest we reject sex and gender altogether in talking about plants, or re-theorize them as quantitative traits. Act 3, Migrant Ecologies. I'm going to propose migrant ecologies as an antidote to the binary language that pervades biology of native alien, male, female, heterosexual, homosexual. A counter-colonial approach, migrant ecologies offers a practical and pragmatic planetary ecology for the afterlives of colonialism. The migrant ecologies do not arise from plant ecological sciences of contemporary biology, but rather from nature cultural approaches to plant worlds and the histories of colonial extractive economies that unleashed a grand reshuffling of plants, animals, and humans during colonial regimes. It arises from the ongoing neo-colonial extractive regimes of commerce and trade, unchecked development of land, and a refusal to act on the urgent signs of hastening climate change. The theorizing of migrant ecologies are both useful and necessary for our moment for many reasons. Migrant ecologies offer a nature cultural approach by refusing to reduce a plant to a particular individual presence in a particular place, and instead urges us to narrate a nature cultural history of the plant through histories of empire. How did we get here? What are its histories? It forces us to track the extractive ambitions of colonial botany, plant discoveries long known to locals but now named for empire. It forces us to recognize that the majority of foreign species are here because of their colonial histories, especially their horticultural appeal. Migrant ecologies offers understandings of plants not only as individual or independent organisms, but as embrangled in other ecologies, particularly political ecologies of colonialism, enslavement, hegemony, globalization, and land management. It takes multiple genealogies of colonialism so we can bring post-colonial, anti-colonial, decolonial, counter-colonial, and indigenous ecologies together. It allows us to narrate how plant afterlives vary depending on their colonial travels. It offers us an embodied affective ecology. Instead of terms such as global or transnational, migrant ecology centers the plant, animal, and human as complex embodied beings, both enslaved and exuberant. It attempts to capture multi-species and entangled lives within ecologies, economies, and histories. It helps us transcend the limits of species and taxa and forces us to think of migrants as a process of migration, not biological taxa. It is an act that includes various modes such as voluntary, forced, and coerced migration. It embraces a transnational vision of planetary life. It forces us to track the overflows and underflows of life on Earth, track how individuals and communities move as more than human worlds. It challenges any easy colonial border and legal regime that divide families and friends through easily drawn geographic borders. It forces us to embrace change and fluidity and recognize that evolutionary history is never static. Organisms are forever adapting to their environments, and change is the norm, not the exception. It allows us to embrace Darwin's entangled bank with its plethora of species in complex webs of relationality. Within such frameworks, invasive ecologies that valorize Edenic visions are anathema. It recognizes the interdependence of human diasporas and botanical diasporas, insisting on relationality, linking migrating communities, and forever binding them to the lands and ancestors they left behind, yet never collapsing the two into some essentialized mythical past. And finally, it recognizes that human and botanical diasporas have the same etymology. Refusing these binaries, it links migrating communities and binds them to the lands and ancestors they left behind. Diasporas allow us for more imaginative sexualities, the possibility of miscegenation and cross-fertilization through a politics of assimilation or of remaining resolutely unique and distinct through a politics of isolation and separatism. In short, invasive ecologies and binary reproduction are fundamentally unecological and ahistorical, while migrant ecologies moves us to a world where we are attuned to the histories of botanical colonization, where we recenter political ecologies of botanical commerce, market forces, horticultural innovation, technologized and reproductive labor, and industrialized agriculture. As we reframe colonial ecologies of the human, we must extend these imaginations to plants and animals as well. A botanical history reminds us that plant biogeography is a product of colonial extractive economies, continued human greed for larger houses and cheaper disposable product, short-term profits preferred over long-term health of the planet. Migrant ecologies is not an embrace of the anarchic development project, but a reckoning with colonial histories. The story of planet Earth is the story of Pangaea, the supercontinent that fractured into continental formations, moving species and leading to dizzying evolutionary adaptations. Then, in the flash of planetary time, colonialism reknit the seams of Pangaea, as Crosby argues. Biological exchanges and movement created a world-spanning economic system. In the deep history of human evolution, we are all migrants. The embrangled story of life on Earth is not a singular or universal, but complex and multiple. In this deep history of time and the evolutionary histories of humans out of Africa, who is native and foreign? The embrangled story of life on Earth is not singular or universal, but complex and multiple. Some live where they were born, but others, like me, are shaped by generations of migration. My grandparents, parents, my sister, and I are all migrants through and through. There is nothing innocent about this. Migrations have been forced, coerced, and voluntary. These are tales of abjection, enslavement, victimization, and also ones of opportunity, adventure, celebration, and joy. Primarily trained as an evolutionary biologist, life on Earth for me is never about stasis or being rooted in one place. As Lewis Carroll's Red Queen famously quipped, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. Inspired by Charles Darwin, I dreamed of a polyphonic, polymorphic biological imagination. Growing up in post-independent, multi-religious India, life was about plurality. In my lifetime, I have been stunned by the rise of an insular nativism and nationalism in both the country of my birth and now citizenship in the United States. A violent, virulent xenophobia across species. Even more remarkable is that in both nations, the majority claim victimhood from the minority. While the biota of the world have been profoundly shaped by colonialism, migrant life did not begin with European colonialism. Humans, animals, and plants have always moved. After all, in the deep history of life on Earth, who belongs where? With the continents constantly in motion, we are never still. Life evolves through the everyday, through peace and tumult, through greed and grace. This is what the planet is. A dynamic ball of mutating, migrating, and mobilizing more than human worlds. Thank you.
So we are 4 conveners to the module, and 2 are here in person. That's Stefan and I, and 2 are elsewhere. So Christos Linteris is in St. Andrews, and is in his office, I think. And Joanna is in Leticia, Colombia, Colombian Amazonia. And we are going to take turns to present the network in relation to our work. So, Christos, since you're there, do you want to start? We change the order of the
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Slides. Yes.
Yes, great. Hi everyone. I'm sorry I couldn't be there. That was a sudden change of plans, but yeah, here you go. So, well, yeah, I'm the more unorthodox, I think, of conveners for this research network, insofar as my research is on zoonotic diseases. I'm a medical anthropologist, and so I come to plants from a left field area, as it were, because I'm interested in plants and poisons as these relate to diseases that spread from animals to humans, or as these are supposed to be related to these. And I'm not talking here about the obvious aspect of plants and zoonotic diseases, which are the ecologies of the animals that carry these, which is, of course, a very important aspect in global health and in the history of medicine, but more about, if you like, imagined ways in which plants can relate to these diseases. And this interest really emerged for me about 10 years or more ago, when I was at CRASSH, leading a couple of projects on bubonic plague. And it was then that I came across this very interesting news clip from the Straits Times in Singapore from June 1894, which noted that apparently smoking opium was being considered by British colonial officers in the then colony of Hong Kong as a prophylactic against plague. And at the time, Hong Kong was experiencing a really significant plague outbreak, which would then become a global pandemic. And I soon discovered that this was not an isolated incident. In fact, the British Royal Opium Commission a little earlier had claimed that opium was a good prophylactic against malaria. And colonial officers in Hong Kong then went on to have one of those major fights that medical officers in colonies usually have about whether this is true or not, whether smoking opium is the best way to protect people from catching the plague. Now, this has a very interesting kind of afterlife in other outbreaks in China, which is my area proper of study, such as in the plague outbreak in Manchuria in 1910. to 11, when it was, of all things, Scottish missionaries, doctors that endorsed opium smoking as a prophylactic against plague. And that was contested by the chief Chinese expert on the disease, Dr. Wu Yande, who was a leading member of the National Anti-Opium Association. So he really didn't like the idea. And then 10 years later, when plague arrived again in Manchuria, Dr. Wu Yande, who was by then the chief of the North Manchurian Plague Prevention Service, this is the first epidemiological apparatus in the Republic of China, was very disturbed to find that Japanese entrepreneurs operating in Manchuria, which was an area which was semi-colonized or colonized in complex ways by the Russians and the Japanese at the time, were actually leading a lucrative business in opium dens in the context of a new outbreak of plague. And that really caught my attention at the time because of the well-known role of opium in the semi-colonization, or whatever you want to call it, of China, or in especially British colonialism as operative in that country. But much later, I linked this by then dormant interest in opium versus plague with another interesting and forgotten datum I came across, which relates more closely to this network and directly to Françoise's research from the past. And that had to do with the apparent use in the first half and second half of the 19th century by various doctors in Britain, in France, and in Germany of curare, who I'm sure you all know, as a cure rather than a prophylactic of rabies. And there are several instances of experiments with curare as a prophylactic, as a cure for rabies or hydrophobia, as it was known at the time, but also some in situ cures which were supposedly effective. And the most famous one was in 1874 in Prussia by Dr. Offenberg, who apparently cured a girl called Anna Heitmann, who had been bitten by a dog, by injecting her with subsequent several doses of curare, which could have been very dangerous, but apparently cured her. Now, hence my interest in this topic and on how plants and their substances, if you like, accrue epistemic value as cures of infectious and specifically zoonotic diseases in the course of the 19th century and early 20th century, or in terms of their users, that being usually colonial scientists, how plant poisons, as they would have been characterized at the time, were imagined as antidotes to so-called animal poisons. And at the time, zoonotic diseases were conceptualized as animal poisons. In fact, the term zoonosis, which is coined by Virchow, is kind of an improvement of the German term on the poisons by beasts or by animals. And my question here is whether these use, if you like, points to more than medical, ontological, political, or other affordances of poison against poison relations, but also on how indigenous plant-based substances enter biomedical experimental systems. And you will probably know that the curare really became kind of very famous as part of an experimental system in the work of Claude Bernard, the kind of the father of experimental medicine, as Grumek, the historian of medicine, has shown very, very exhaustively in his study of Bernard. It's a very, very complex in which curare entered experimental systems. But what interests me here is not so much success stories, such as the story of Claude Bernard, but where it's, if you like, the epistemic appropriation of these plant/poisons lead to scientific breakthroughs, as much as cases where their use in such experimental systems remains ambivalent or becomes contested, and how this epistemic status works in the context of original accumulation. So in Marx's sense, or primitive accumulation is the wrong translation in English, original accumulation in colonial settings within the communities from which these substances were extracted in the first place.
Okay. Thank you very much, Christos.
Okay. So, so my name is Johanna Gonzalez Martin. I'm from Venezuela. I'm currently living in Colombia, but I'm originally from Venezuela. And I'm a medical doctor trained in Venezuela. And then I did epidemiology and social anthropology. And I'm about to start a Marie Curie fellowship at the University of Bologna on plants, which is the first time I'm formally going to work on plants. And I'll tell you a bit of how I got to that point. On healing plants is the name of the project. So I began working as a medical doctor with the Yanomami people on the border between Venezuela and Brazil. Their territory spans the two countries, and walking a lot with people through paths in which we would go to visit villages like the one you see here, and carrying often loads of medicine. I'm also carrying stuff, but I'm taking the picture, so you can't see it. But yeah, carrying heavy loads of pharmacological medicines. I was working as a doctor, so this is what we did. We went to the villages and treated people. You see here a health promoter, a health agent, and they were also really like well versed in dosing, cutting, administering all these medicines, right? So it seemed like I was first a doctor, then I did my field work in anthropology here. It seemed like the thing of the medicines, of the pharmacological medicines, was like the what was highlighted, the foreground of the picture, and the background, the plants were a bit like the complementary, the thing that didn't show up in the everyday exchanges with medical people. So obviously this is reversed, and people use a lot of these plants for healing, but it was very common to have people ask for these medicines in health posts and so on, and they were very prevalent and very appreciated. So there were also, as I spent more and more a feeling amongst many of them that that people who were close to health posts were not using anymore the medicinal plant, the healing plants they knew. And it's not, the Yanomami are not one of these people whose knowledge and relationships with plants and with their environment is really endangered. They're quite numerous, and let's say their contact process is quite recent, since the 1960s. So in a sense, it was funny to hear people saying, "Oh, people before us, the elders, they really knew how to heal, and the shamans really knew how to heal." And it's been a reason why many of these Yanomami people have been engaged in actually recovering these plants. So I'll show you something that actually comes from Brazil, and this is a work of other people, including William Milliken, who will be in the series later on, from the Kew Gardens, and Bruce Albert, the different anthropologists, but also the Yanomami organizations in Brazil. And they wanted to collect these medicines in a manual, in a book, right? A bit like the ones that Stephen was showing. And this is a bit different from the usual collections of botanical species of like medicinal plants that heal, that only have the name, the local name and the Latin name. And we were speaking about names and let's say the Portuguese name in this case. But it's funny, like these translations are already pointing to, if you see the word in Yanomami, heri mamotima means a transformative thing, that and what they speak of it, and it's translated into Portuguese into remedy, into medicine, right? So yeah, it's funny how the translation, even though this was an effort done with indigenous peoples, the translation already is showing something of the difficulties in speaking about plants as being as transformative power. And you see here, it's the name, the Latin name, a few other questions that usually don't come in the research articles, like how are they used, in which quantity, where do they collect them, and so on, right? And the plant here. So this is another tuber that is both medicine and food. So we start seeing here as well how some of these categories that come into medicine are also food plants. And another part that is interesting in this book is the stories of the elders, speaking of what I was mentioning before. So it also has stories of the elders saying how their elders knew more of the plants. So it's an interesting book in which it already brings some of these stories that people tell about these plants as beings and people that they used to relate, but it's still a partial translation in that it brings us back to the names and to what they heal, where many of these plants here are not just healing, but also food. So fast forward to 2019, I moved to Colombia, unable to return really to do more work and research in the Venezuelan Amazon. And yeah, so I moved in 2019 and the pandemic struck a couple of months later. And I was living in Leticia already, and something that was curious about that time. So at the beginning, there was a big fear that this was going to be another epidemic that would decimate indigenous peoples, given also the dire conditions of their health systems and the abandonment and neglect that was accentuated during that time. But you would hear also a very common narrative that we also found in different newspapers and organizations, that indigenous peoples were abandoned by the state, but they had their medicinal plants that then saved them, right? So we see here a more traditionalist, the Siecopais ancestral remedy to the pandemic in the Amazon, but also other accounts like this one of Betty Sosa. She lives 5 kilometers away from my home, healing with traditional medicines. And you see her, she's a health agent and she's dressed up in all the gown. And what you can't read, you can read in the article, is how she was not using only the traditional plants, the ancestral knowledge, but also garlic, ginger, all kinds of other plants that were lemon, and also aspirin. So these are plants that travel really well, the healing plants, right? But also the way in which they were using things like aspirin or paracetamol was not, they were not using plants, healing plants as medicines as we do, in this sense of the remedy, the medicine, the constitution of the plant, but really using the aspirin as a plant. So mixing it in concoctions and giving it in a liquid instead of a pill. You see, so a way in which the translation was working in their direction of a relationship with the plants. But what we usually expect and what usually happens when these plants travel to other places is actually that they become compounds, pharmacological compounds in research articles that then are exploiting and actually, of course, trying to find the market value of some of these plants. And we see here another image from another article, and how you can decompose the plant into a substance and then find its bioactive compounds and so on, and treat something like a virus here. So we see all the elements of a translation of the plant as it actually moves really well. And Christos was commenting some of that to the pharmacological world. So we had, Banu was showing us of the invasive plants, and this is a very different example of how these plants travel really well, and they travel really well with the epidemics, especially. So that's part of what I'm interested in doing in my new project, following historically how these plants have traveled throughout the Amazon and being shared and move with people, not just germs and pathogens and peoples, but also the plants. So this is what led me actually, and well, in the next slide, we see some of these translations. So even in the words of some of the most important Waorani leaders, Nancy Wikita, is interesting to read it, not as it's translated into English from the Spanish she speaks, but also from the Waorani language she speaks. So she speaks of the rainforest as a market, as a pharmacy, but it's already a partial translation in which she gives other clues. We have like doctors have their medicine, their thing, we have our rainforest, where we have these medicinal healing plants. So she speaks already of healing plants. It's not a medicinal plant as a thing, it's a healing plant as a person, as somebody that they relate to in their rainforest, in their relationships with the land. So in the words of Nemo Wikita, who is also a very important younger leader of the Waorani people in Ecuador, she gives, when she speaks, she's saying it was not just the plants, and this is what I also found in Leticia. The plants by themselves don't heal. It was the whole connection, the whole organization, the whole communication between communities with the people who knew, who remembered the previous epidemics, who had to go back and start identifying plants and leaves and roots that they had perhaps not used in a long time, or other people knew. And these stories were everywhere in Leticia, people sharing, learning from other peoples, from other places in Peru, learning from their own plants, like trying to find what was going to lead them through healing in this time of COVID that was a time of great uncertainty. So in contrast to other parts of the world where COVID debilitated people, many of the stories that we find in the Amazon was, as she says, like coming back to life and having a great achievement and strength. So returning to these plants, to these transformative plants, was actually a source of strength and power for people. And I think that's also what we want to highlight in this network, with the idea of something like RAW, which is not called RAW everywhere, but this power of plants. So this is what what led me to this project, in which I'm going to look at the circulation, the movement of plants during epidemics, and really trying to find if there are other ways that we can speak about these healing plants, right? Not just collecting, which was very common during the pandemic, collecting the plants that people use for healing and how they're used. But sometimes these are garlic and ginger. They cut borders between what is native, what is foreign, and also what is medicine, what is food, what is poison as well, and also what is people and what is a thing, right? And in Portuguese, this is a Yanomami artist from Venezuela. And I think what I see in this art from him is all the connections, the importance of path and movement. And if we can see that these paths and movements are not just done by humans, but also by the plants moving, being moved, growing in different places, and understanding, as he says, the whole urihi, they call the whole forest land that people see and experience and relate to when they're walking around it, and knowing the plants, the animals, and their traces, so how they move in the forest. So he says how the shamans know this, but also people get to know these things. So how do we think of a way of following the circulation of plants that is perhaps looking at the history of it, but also exploring the ways, the stories that people tell, and other ways that people might be trying to speak art, sense, perform, sing about these relationships with plants as beings, as healing plants, not as medicinal plants, not as things. So this is a way that I got into after many years of doing medicine and anthropology, and being the plants in the background, to really, in this new phase, like going with the plants as people in the foreground. Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay. I hope everybody online can see the slides. I hope I won't talk too long. I am coming to this topic as a historian of science, and as a historian of science who has spent an awful lot of time, probably too much. I've also done other things. I've worked on heredity and genealogy and these kind of issues, but probably spent far too much time looking at Linnaeus. Linnaeus already showed up, and I've put on this slide two images. One that looks familiar probably from Banu's presentation, and another one, 2 pages from Linnaeus's most famous or most sort of influential book. It's certainly not a good read. I don't recommend to read it from beginning to end. The Species Plantarum, which he published in 1753, and which was a catalogue of all known species of the world back then, with these little paragraphs for each plant species, with their binomial names, their famous Latin names, followed by a synonymy, which sometimes includes indigenous names. So all the names that others have used, and then sometimes a little note on where that plant grows, or some oddity, or who sent it, and these kind of things. So both images are sort of exemplary for the usual image we have of Linnaeus as someone being sort of a figurehead of one aspect of the Enlightenment, its obsession with classification and rational order, his own personal obsession with sex, which there are many dimensions, not only the plant dimension, the sexual system, sort of presenting sexuality as universal and also as a kind of universal ordering principle. There's a lot to be said about what goes on in the system further down. Yeah, it's not as systematic as one might think, but I leave that out. So Banu mentioned Lorna Schiebinger's work, but her own work as well have characterized this kind of botany as an aid for colonial expansion, which it clearly is. These kind of catalogs become routine genres in botanical literature. And Lorna Schiebinger has also coined this nice expression of linguistic imperialism. So Linnaeus gives the names, and then somehow magically they stick and replace everything else. Okay, so that's the usual image we have of Linnaeus. Now, I've become interested through a little detour, sort of in the other side of Linnaeus. There is another side. The detour was that I became interested in another thing that he was very famous for in the 18th century, namely having been in Lapland. That's supposedly a very far away place. It's desolate, it's cold, there are strange people there living with strange animals, and he was able to sell himself as someone who had been there and brought original language back from there. I did field work up in Lapland, following sort of retracking his journey with my partner, Elena Isaev. We had lots of interesting conversations about Linnaeus. So that's drawn me into another side. But I want to illustrate my point that there is another side through another example. These are Linnaeus throughout his life wasn't really content with the sexual system. He thought that the big aim of botany should be to outline what he already called a natural system of plant families, genera, species, classes. And he spent all his life trying to delineate this natural system. Now, the problem with the natural system is that it's supposedly based on similarities. And similarity is something that is intractable. Yeah, you cannot really say what similar is. There's a wonderful article about that by Nelson Goodman, the philosopher, but in the volume, interestingly edited by Mary Douglas and a philosopher of biology, David Hull. What you can do, though, is try. And as you see here, Linnaeus tries all his life to delineate these natural plant families, basically groups of genera that somehow share something fundamental. They share affinity. Affinity becomes the term, a term imported from genealogy and also taken very seriously in its genealogical meaning. It's not just a metaphor, as many historians unfortunately have put it. It's the central concept in 18th century natural philosophy, chemistry, physics, magnetism, electricity, and Linnaeus uses it as well. Practically, it works, the exploration of the natural system for Linnaeus worked by the manipulation of lists. He lists plant genera he thinks belong somehow together, that are similar to each other. He creates these little mini lists, and this is an example for a family that he decides to call Luridae, and that is today known as Solanaceae, the nightshades. There's a good old medieval English name for that plant family as well. There are also names for that in German and in Swedish. And it includes a whole range of plants. I've translated one of these lists. So tomato, potato, cape gooseberry, henbane, tobacco, belladonna, mandrake, datura, mullein, celsia, foxglove. And as you can see from these various attempts of Linnaeus to outline the borders of this natural group, it's a dynamic thing. He changes his minds. He adds things like here. You can hardly see that. Well, I can hardly see that. Yes, here he adds cannabis. Yeah. Now, why does he think these all belong together? Well, that's the interesting thing. It's not because of their flowers. It is because they all share an outward appearance. They are all shady or lurid. He calls them suspect because we get perfectly edible and very good food plants here, but we also get drugs, stimulants like tobacco. He was a heavy smoker, but also things like mandrake and datura, which play, of course, a huge role in European traditional medicine, botanical pharmacology. So there's both something about them that unites them from their outer appearance, but they also share an inner virtue, as it was called. They are suspect, as he says. They are suspect. They can be both things. They are ambiguous. They sit on the fence. Now, what is really interesting is, and that has been shown in a book by Michael Kivac, Why Asians Are Yellow, I think is the title. Luridus is the Latin word for pale yellow, fahl in German. Well, that doesn't tell many people something, but and it's the same color term that at some point Linnaeus chooses to use to describe the skin color of Asians. That's why Asians are yellow, because the 18th century German translation would have been gelb, yellow. What one sees here is that Linnaeus is actually perfectly possible to step out of his obsession with classification and reason on the basis of analogy, similarity, and it's an instance of quite wild thinking, to use Levi-Strauss's metaphor. And that's perhaps the point really that interests me. What we forget often when we talk about Linnaeus is that he was not a metropolitan scientist. He came from a tiny village in the middle of the poorest province of Sweden, Småland. He went to 2 Swedish universities, which were okay, but he didn't have enough money to visit lectures. He basically was self-trained. So he's actually, and scholars in the 1960s and 70s have written a lot about this, steeped in folklore and but also all sorts of esoteric knowledge traditions of his time, alchemy, etc., etc. So this is his first manuscript, actually, which is all about this. Rural knowledge about medicinal plants, alchemical traditions that are idiosyncratic to Sweden, etc. And this is the book that he was most proud of and that I think would revolutionize the world. 1766 Clavis Medicinae Duplex, which tried to correlate tastes and smells of plants with their pharmaceutical virtues, with their natural families. And it's incomprehensible, frankly. If you want to know about it, ask me later, but it's incomprehensible and fell dead. So why am I interested in this other side? Because I think it is important to bring out that there is, of course, also something like European indigeneity. Yeah. And there is, I think, I'm particularly interested in situations, for example, when Linnaeus travels to Lapland and encounters Sami, where there is a degree of coevalness, despite its denial once Linnaeus returns. So I've just published a paper on what Linnaeus writes about an insect parasite, the reindeer warblefly, and all its the multi-species interactions that go on between that fly, the Sami, the mushrooms they use to burn to drive away the fly, the reindeer, the dogs that hurt. He writes all about this. Yeah, so that's quite interesting. Yeah, so that's where I'm coming from. Yeah. Thank you.
My slides are a bit of an overview of how I became interested in plants, and it's the Quechua people I work with in the Amazon are obsessed with plants, and they forced me to work with plants. There is no other way of describing it. And plants and shamanism was what they were most interested in, and they were interested in as John described, by walking through the forest. And walked they did, and they were never still. So I was also led to question the anthropological interpretation in terms of villages, groups, because what became much more fascinating was the movement and the exchanges of plants. And I followed the trade of curare to start with, and that was most interesting. So I've been following this Quechua group for 50 years now, and it has generated such a revitalization through the indigenous movements in the last 20 years. And this is a still from the film Shuku Shuku, which was the first phyto film in 2012. And it's now a flourishing genre in Brazil. But it was there all the time in hiding. So in my fieldwork area is quite close to the Andes. It's in this upper Amazon region that is on the eastern foothills of the Andes, and it has a very, very deep archaeology. So this is the oracle called the Lanson, which is part of the culture of Chavin de Huanta. And this was dated 2000 BC, but the site predates that. And this oracle post, which it has been well preserved, is actually a representation of all the exchanges between tobacco, cactus, San Pedro cactus, and Vilca and Anadenthera peregrina, which was the main drug of the prehistorical Americas through intercontinental exchanges. And this figure completely cuts across the Andean world and the Amazonian world, which for a long time and still now have remained separate, and also make us question domestication and exchange. And it's all about row, because the mediators who were priests or shamans were actually using these plants of power to do their politics, and so this was in pre-Inca chiefdoms, and much later in colonial times it continued, and I became very interested in this interethnic relations through plants. So during colonial times, people continued subversive shamanic activities, although they were victims of the Inquisition to start with, and then later had to hide or had their rebellions suppressed. And the shamanism still shows the dialectics of coloniality in the way that plants are classified locally, and in the ways that they are used. And this also integrates the plants that were commercialized and commodified during colonial times, like sarsaparilla, which was the main treatment for syphilis in Europe, is imported. So what I'm trying to do now is in the book that is ongoing is to trace shamans' portraits and trajectories and show their genealogies, their exchanges, the part they play in healthcare, and also the fact that they never take themselves too seriously. And you see the photo of Stephen and my friend Don Rilbert, who is donning a tourist outfit to win the shaman competition in the town of Iquitos in Peru, and replays the scene for us to his grandsons, which was a very memorable day, very fun. But the knowledge that these plant knowers have, and this has come up in the session today, is remarkable and needs to be shown through their stories and their portraits. And they are very complex people with a dialogic past. They are not indigenous guardians of the forest. They are mediators. So that led me to want to give something back, and the way to do this was to be involved in partnerships to create life pharmacies where people in endangered environments could have access to their raw plants or their other plants, because raw meat, it's not only entheogens and inebriants, it's also medicines and hunting poisons they still use, and fishing poisons as well. So, and midwifery plants. So we created two reserve projects. One lasted from 1997 to 2014, which is roughly the average duration of a reserve, because they have a time scale, and very few projects outlast this time scale. And there is one which is still ongoing now, which is the Grandmother's Garden, which was created around the filming of a documentary about indigenous midwives who were victimized, who were criminalized for practicing their art. So we created a garden where it was their idea to transmit the knowledge to the younger women. And that led to creating a database of plants. And now I'm having created it with the Alice software, with funding from DEFRA. And I would like to translate it into a more local friendly database in the style that Stephen has shown and Joanna has shown of William Milliken. So that's ongoing, and I'm still working with midwives, and the renewal of midwifery is part of a much broader indigenous women's movement. The women have now come up with their manioc as well, and they have become shamans, leaders, and artists. And they are very assertive. And as you see, these two Shipibo artists have presented the world over in the same way that shamanic male artist shamans have had exhibitions in the main capital cities of the world. But the midwives are quietly making their way, and they complain that their knowledge is a dying art, but they transmit it to their daughters and granddaughters quite successfully. So this is what I'm doing.